The final phase does not begin with a collapse. It begins with recognition, not a single announcement, not a sudden shock, but a gradual acceptance across markets that the environment has fundamentally changed. The assumptions that once supported aggressive borrowing, stable growth, predictable refinancing, and continuous liquidity are no longer reliable foundations. And once that recognition becomes embedded, behavior shifts in a way that is difficult to reverse. The analysis at this stage is no longer centered on expansion or even stabilization. It is centered on recalibration. Companies, investors, and institutions begin to align their expectations with a reality where capital is more expensive, access is more selective, and risk is more visible. This recalibration is not uniform. It occurs at different speeds, across different sectors, influenced by varying levels of exposure and resilience. But the direction is consistent. Leverage is reduced where possible. Balance sheets are simplified. Strategies are adjusted to prioritize durability over growth. A common misunderstanding persists even here. When markets stabilize after periods of volatility, it is often interpreted as a return to normal. But what defines normal has shifted. Stability in a high-leverage, low-cost environment is fundamentally different from stability in a constrained, higher-cost one. The metrics may appear similar: steady prices, moderate growth, but the underlying dynamics are not. The margin for error is smaller, the tolerance for inefficiency is lower, and the consequences of misalignment are more immediate. The hidden system that becomes visible in this phase is the cumulative effect of constraints. Over time, each adjustment, higher interest costs, tighter lending standards, reduced liquidity, compounds. Individually, these changes are manageable. Collectively, they redefine the operating environment. Companies that once relied on external financing to bridge gaps must now rely more heavily on internal cash generation. This shift places pressure on operational performance, forcing a closer alignment between revenue, costs, and obligations. Evidence of this transition can be observed in capital allocation decisions. Share buybacks decline, not because they are no longer valued, but because they are no longer sustainable under current conditions. Acquisitions become more selective, with greater emphasis on strategic fit rather than financial engineering. Investment shifts toward projects with clearer, shorter-term returns. These changes reflect a broader realignment away from leveraging financial conditions and toward managing within them. The implications extend beyond corporate strategy. They influence the broader economic trajectory. Reduced leverage and more conservative capital allocation can lead to slower growth, but also to greater stability over time. The system becomes less prone to extreme fluctuations, but also less capable of rapid expansion. This trade-off is not inherently negative, but it represents a departure from the dynamics that defined the previous cycle. As this recalibration progresses, the escalation gives way to resolution, not in the sense of a clean endpoint, but in the sense of a new equilibrium. Some companies will have successfully adapted, restructuring their operations and strengthening their balance sheets. Others will have exited the system through default, acquisition, or dissolution. These outcomes are not evenly distributed, and their effects will be felt across industries and regions. One of the most important, yet often overlooked, aspects of this resolution is the redistribution of risk. It does not disappear. It shifts. Investors who once held corporate debt may have absorbed losses or adjusted their portfolios. Lenders may have tightened standards, reducing future exposure. New participants may enter the system under different assumptions. The structure evolves, but the underlying principles remain. Risk is inherent. It can be managed, distributed, and mitigated, but not eliminated. The psychological dimension reaches a form of equilibrium as well. Expectations adjust. What once seemed like an anomaly, higher borrowing costs, constrained liquidity, becomes normalized. Behavior stabilizes around these new expectations. Decision-making becomes more disciplined, not necessarily by choice, but by necessity. The memory of stress influences future actions, shaping how risk is perceived and managed. But even in this apparent stability, the system carries forward the imprint of what occurred. The lessons learned about leverage, liquidity, and dependency become part of the framework through which future decisions are made. Regulations may adjust, market practices may evolve, and institutional behavior may shift. These changes are not always immediate or comprehensive, but they contribute to the long-term evolution of the system. The transition, then, is not from crisis to safety, but from one set of conditions to another. The corporate debt time bomb does not explode in a single moment. It diffuses through a series of adjustments, pressures, and recalibrations. Its impact is not defined by a dramatic event, but but by a prolonged process that reshapes how capital is used, how risk is managed, and how stability is understood. And in that process, the most critical realization emerges. The risk was never just the amount of debt. It was the dependence on a specific set of conditions to sustain it. When those conditions changed, the system was forced to confront its own assumptions, not all at once, and not without resistance, but inevitably. What remains is a landscape that looks familiar on the surface: companies operating, markets functioning, capital flowing, but beneath that surface, the structure has shifted. The tolerance for leverage is lower, the scrutiny of risk is higher, and the understanding of stability is more grounded in the realities of constraint rather than the expectations of abundance. The danger, then, was never entirely hidden. It was embedded in plain sight, normalized through repetition, and sustained through alignment of incentives. And the resolution, rather than eliminating the danger, has redefined it, transforming it from an overlooked vulnerability into a recognized boundary within which the system must now operate.